Hello. Welcome to Foreign Policy's virtual dialogue, The American War in Afghanistan. Today, we're going to sit down with the author, Carter Malkasian, the winner of the 2022 Lionel Gelber Book Prize. My name is Janine DiGiovanni, and I'm coming to you from Kyiv in the Ukraine. It's my pleasure to be with you to host this morning. Actually, it's evening here for me. Today, we're going to take a look at this incredible book, but also the shortlist and Carter's book, of course, which was the winner of the Gelber Prize. I was honored to be a member of the jury. We're going to have the opportunity to dive deep into the book, The American War in Afghanistan, A History. Now, while the book's focus is about Afghanistan, and we are now pivoting away in many respects from the war and the withdrawal in Afghanistan. The Taliban is further cracking down on the media. There's increasing restrictions on women, on girls' schools, and the expanding detainments of minority groups. So now more than ever, it is really important to keep focusing on Afghanistan and not let it slip away from the news and also from our consciousness. Carter's account draws on primary sources and takes the reader through the very complicated politics, military, socio-cultural forces that shaped Afghanistan's longest war. And having been there literally when the Taliban fell back in 2000, right after 9/11, 2001, this book was especially interesting for me. I really do hope you get a chance to read it. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you to our partner for this Gelber Book Prize, the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, for helping us make this event possible. So before we get started, we've got some housekeeping to go through. We want to be sure we hear from you, our audience. We have hundreds of people here tuned in on Zoom, as well as watching our live streams in social media. So we've reserved a portion of this event for questions from you, our global audience. Here's how to write to us. If you're on Zoom, click on the Q&A button and submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, your organization, and where you are writing from, what part of the world you are in. If you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us your questions. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com. That's events@foreignpolicy.com. Of course, we invite you to chime in on our social media. Be sure to use the hashtag Gelber Prize, hashtag GELBER Prize. Please tweet us. So let's get started. First of all, I'm really delighted to introduce Janice Stein, who has been our jury chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize. She is also the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. She's also the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, which is also at the University of Toronto. She's an extremely prolific voice on political science and international relations. We're really lucky to have her. And also, as a member of the jury, I have to say, she held us together. She was an incredibly important bonding force for all of us. So Janice, welcome.
Thank you so much, Janine. And great that you could make time from Kyiv to join us this morning. That's wonderful. It is a great pleasure to say a word about these 5 shortlisted books by the Lionel Gelber Prize. But let me just take a second to thank the family of Lionel Gelber. The Gelber family continues to care about well-written, deeply researched books that endure and speak to the big issues of our time. We need this more than ever. I also want to thank our dedicated jurors, Janine, who was a juror, Francis Gavin, the distinguished professor and inaugural director of the Henry Kissinger Center at Johns Hopkins University, James Goldgeier, a senior fellow at Brookings and former dean of the School of International Service at American Universities, Doug Sonder, the senior international correspondent for the Globe and Mail, and a winner of the National Newspaper Award. And I should say as well that Janine is not only the foreign affairs columnist for FP, but she's also a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale. So this was a vigorous jury with strong views and lots of debate. All 5 of the books this year approach the present by looking back at history. I think it's remarkable that they, despite the difference in their foci, every one of them understands how important history is to the understanding of the present. So let me start first with the one that goes furthest back, Geoffrey Weidlinger's In the Midst of Civilized Europe. And Geoffrey asks a question, and it could not be more relevant today. He asks, what causes us to change our view of our neighbors, of a different religion, a different identity, transforming neighbors and friends into invaders, enemies, and threats? Now, Geoffrey's book deals in part with Ukraine 100 years ago, but those questions are just as important today as they were when the violence slowly began. Geoffrey focuses on the shift toward violent distrust of Jewish Europeans that really begins after the First World War. And he finds through incredible search in the archives, documents, and narratives, and he uncovers early warnings that if the violence persisted, it would lead to the mass murder of Jews in this part of the world. This is 1919, 1920, long before the race hatred became official policy in the 1930s. This book is, in some sense, a revelation because it is so current and yet so deeply steeped in history. It begins with angry acts in villages and districts, then escalates to wider pogroms and expulsions, and then to violence that is tolerated by political leaders. I know history doesn't repeat itself, but there is something eerie about the story that Geoffrey Weidlinger tells. When I spoke to him, I asked him if he thought his book would speak to the present. And he said with horror in his voice, not in the way that it is right now. The next 2 books, the first one by Emily Bast and the Plague, and the second by the historian Neil Ferguson, Doom, deal brilliantly with the extraordinary uncertainty that has shaped both our past and our present. And to end the Plague, Emily explores from a very personal perspective the plague before this one, the global epidemic of AIDS that killed millions around the world, especially in Africa. What makes this book so stunning is Emily starts from the ground up with a riveting examination of the lives of activists who organized to press President George Bush to lead a global strategy to fund and support those who were working desperately to bring the AIDS pandemic, because that's what it was, under control. From the vantage point of 2022, it seems almost impossible to believe that 20 years ago, community groups worked with a Republican president who trusted the science and cared enough about people who were unlikely ever to vote for him to launch a global program to fight AIDS. Emily's book is riveting. And again, it uses history to inform the present and teaches us all how important community engagement, especially by women, is at every level. Neil Ferguson, a historian who is focused largely on diplomatic history, picks up the threads from Emily and writes about pandemic, plague, and disaster in Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe. His book asks a question that I think has puzzled many of us. Why was a developed, rich, democratic society like the United States not better prepared to deal with COVID? Why did COVID not only ravage America, but also polarize it the way he has? Neil reaches across history, economics, network theory, and climate science to try to answer that question. And he shows us how complex and bureaucratic societies are increasingly less nimble, less local, less flexible, and therefore less able to adapt to uncertainty and unpredictability. Neil provides no easy answers, but he asks the right questions. The fourth book on the short list, by Rush Doshi, The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, asks one of the biggest questions that will face us over these next 2 decades. And he too looks back to history. The book is remarkable because Rush personally collected a huge database of official and unofficial Chinese language documents from Hong Kong, Taiwan, as well as China. And Rush tells us that as long ago as 1981, 1991, just when the Soviet Union was coming apart, the Chinese leadership shifted their focus away from Russia as their principal threat and toward the United States. He takes us through the global financial crisis, the growing divisions and polarizations within American society. But he does that from the Chinese perspective and tells a warning and compelling story about how Chinese leaders have become convinced that the West is in decline and that China will build a new global order based on Chinese hegemony. This is a must-read book for anyone interested in global affairs. Now, I've left for last Carter Malkasian's The American War in Afghanistan, A History. And Janine has already told us something about this absolutely remarkable book. It is remarkable for its content, and I'm not going to say much because I'm anxious for Janine and Carter to start their conversation. But let me say this, that in addition to being original and deeply researched and told from the perspective of somebody who moves from Washington to the smallest local village in Afghanistan, Carter writes beautifully. And so there is not only enlightenment and learning as you read this book, there is pleasure. Do not miss this book. Janine, time to have the conversation with Carter.
Thank you so much, Janice. That was a wonderful wrap up of the winter we had reading these wonderful books. I know I enjoyed it. Carter, thanks so much again, and deep congratulations for this wonderful book, which I, as a writer myself, I understand how absolutely complicated it is putting together a nonfiction book of such depth as you have. So I think my first question, really with my own curiosity, but I'm sure everyone else wants to know, what was the process how did you do this? How did you do the field work, the research? And then how did you actually sit down and put together so many themes, so many issues? How did you pull it all together?
Hey, Janine, thank you for the question, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. And Janice, thank you for all the compliments as well. And I'm truly honored to have received the Gelber Prize. It was unexpected, and it means a tremendous amount to me. So as for your, how did I come up with doing this? I was sitting in Kabul one night. I had just gone back there after my time in Garmsir. I was going to be working for the ISAF commander at the time, General Dunford. And I was trying to think, I was thinking about what I was going to do, how I was going to be working there. And I was reading William Dalrymple's book, Return of the King, which is a great, wonderful book, far better written than my book, actually. I mean, just sucks you right in, and it's
different kind of book entirely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real page turner. But it's about the first British intervention into Afghanistan. But the way he used poetry, different perspectives of the different players that were involved, and how he told the whole story, I kind of thought to myself, well, this is a great kind of book to write, and a great example. At the same time, I knew I could never write that same kind of book. And so I was kind of thinking less about what I was going to do in the next year or two, and I started thinking about what do I want to do in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And I had just completed the book War Comes to Garmsir, which is really about one district over 30 years, something very small and very detailed. And I thought, well, what would I like to do after that? I thought, well, I'd like to take it bigger, and I'd like to cover the whole perspective of maybe the war. And so I started thinking about that. And of course, it took me a long time to put it together. When I was there in 2013, I thought, well, the war will probably end in a year or two. You can tell the United States is drawing down. We're looking at how to get out. So if I, start writing this in 2014 or 2015, then, in a year or so, it should be done. I should have a good, complete book to write. But that's, of course, not what happened. The war kept on going, and new things came up and new issues came up. And I found myself in government on the joint staff longer than I expected to be. So it was a lot of amount of time observing and changing parts of the book until it was ready to be published. And then right as it was getting ready to be published, Biden made the announcement that we were going to leave. So that required a lot of last minute changes to the book. And of course, the book doesn't have the final tragic and incredibly heartrending end to the conflict. But that's kind of that's how I was thinking about things as I was doing it. And one of the things I like to do when I'm writing a book is look at other books as an example. So Dalrymple's is one. I was also very taken when I was writing this book with James McPherson's The Battle Cry of Freedom, which is about the American Civil War, actually. But it's similarly about a conflict from a lot of different perspectives. And so I liked reading that kind of at night, seeing how he was approaching the problems that he was approaching, and trying in some ways to model the book on that. Now, of course, I can't claim to have reached his heights in any way. But I do think it's useful to use other people's examples as a way to do things. And you mentioned like how I went about writing it. So part of the book, honestly, is because so many other wonderful books have been written about our Afghanistan experience, from Sarah Che's Punishment of Virtue to Anand Gopal's No Good Men Among the Living, to more historical works like by Thomas Barfield or David Edwards. I thought it was, and many reports in the New York Times, Globe and Mail, etc. So I thought it was important to be able to incorporate that and in a way synthesize that. But then also I was talking to a lot of Afghans. Since being able to speak Pashto, being able to get out and speak to them in a variety of different areas, enabled me to understand a lot of their perspectives. One of the things that I was able to do, I guess, that I didn't expect, was that when I was in Afghanistan, General Dunford wanted me make sure that he had contact with the women leaders, because he's focused on the war, and he wanted to make sure that he had an understanding of what women leaders were worried about and what their concerns were. And so he would have me go out and talk to a variety of women leaders, and then kind of help him pick who he should be talking to in the small amount of time that he had. And that gave me a perspective I wouldn't have otherwise had, because otherwise I probably would have been too focused on the Afghan police, the Afghan army, what the Taliban were doing. But that helped me understand how how difficult life is for women in Afghanistan, how varied their opinions are. It's not singularly one opinion about what the war is, what the United States is, and the sacrifices that they went through. And so I greatly appreciated doing that. I'll stop. I've been talking too long there, I think.
Oh, that was wonderful. It's interesting that you read other people's books on the topic as you're writing, because when I'm writing a book, I won't read anyone else's book on the topic, because I think it will in some way bias me. So I read them before, and I do all of my field work for years and years. But then when I actually sit down to write, I don't read other people's book, because it distracts me and probably makes me feel too insecure. But okay, my question now for you, Carter, we were briefly talking about this before, is more philosophical. When I was in Afghanistan right after 9/11, and I've went back many, many times, but I was dispatched to Iraq right after Tora Bora, so in December. The world then completely focused on Iraq. Iraq was then forgotten when the Arab Spring came and we focused on Syria. Syria is now utterly forgotten as we focus on Ukraine. Afghanistan, in many ways, is now forgotten. And I know when I hear from my Afghan friends, there's this cry of, have you forgotten about us? You know, I know that Ukraine is absolutely pivotal right now, but how, and when you write you're going to rewrite your introduction, presumably in a few months. It's been 6 months since your book's published. What would you say? What would your message be? How can we keep Afghanistan and the urgency of what it means regionally, but also globally? How do we do that? And why, the bigger question, why do we move so quickly away from wars? Why do we forget about them when the problem is still there? Yemen, for instance, is a completely forgotten war, as are most of the African wars.
It's a good question about why do we forget wars. Some wars we don't forget. Some wars the American people were so involved in, and it touched so much that the war isn't forgotten. And World War II is the obvious example, but Vietnam is even closer, more clearly there. And why do we remember Vietnam? I mean, I wasn't on alive during the Vietnam War. I had family members who were involved in the Vietnam War. I went to Berkeley, where I got to hear a lot about the Vietnam War and the protests and such that happened there. But I think it's because it affected so much of America, both in terms of who was conscripted and who protested against it. On the kind of screen, the videos and such that were on the TV screens at the time. And we should remember, during our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, wounded were not pictured that much. It was kind of commonly understood that there were not going to be videos of wounded and videos of people under surgery in the media. So those kind of experiences make it more remembered. And that makes Vietnam more deeply within the American society. But the Civil War too is more deeply there because of the way it rendered the United States into two. And of course, the long history of emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, all of that keeps the Civil War very, very pertinent for us. Afghanistan is less pertinent for us. Afghanistan was forgotten while we were fighting it. It was remembered when you were there in 2001. It was remembered it was paid attention to during the surge when we had 100,000 troops there and our casualties were the highest that they would be. It was forgotten largely in the following years until what happened last year happened. Forgotten because it was something that our professional soldiers were dealing with, not something that conscripts were dealing with. And that applies whether it's Canadians going into the war, British going into the war, Americans going into the war. It was forgotten because even though we are not happy with the financial costs of it, they weren't so high as to be a dramatic drag on us. And there weren't protests against it. It's hard to remember. It's hard to cite a single protest against the Afghan war in its whole 20 years. Today, because it wasn't remembered well in the first place, and today it's not as well paid attention to so far. I'd say partly because of the Ukraine, but also partly that's a signal of how it played in our national interests. Society wasn't involved, but at the same time, it was always a question of, well, where really does Afghanistan fit? How much does it matter to the United States? Well, it mattered because of terrorism, but terrorism as a threat also decreased over time. So, I mean, I guess that leaves me kind of, skeptical and pessimistic that Afghanistan will be well remembered. Now, as a historian, that doesn't really change anything for me in terms of a book should be written. We should study it, understand it more, try to draw some lessons to it, to share it. But I'm just not optimistic that it is going to be tremendously remembered. And so, I mean, it's kind of a sad end to it. And I think, like you, I have many Afghans who are contacting me frequently, contact me over email, over WhatsApp, et cetera. So I still feel it, that I still feel parts of the war. I still see what's going on in that country. But I suspect that the main way Americans will remember the war is through the increased Afghan population that will reside in the United States. And I'd say the same thing about Canada and Britain, that that'll be our most immediate touch point on that conflict.
It's also very painful, I think, for many Afghan refugees, for instance, who after the evacuation or the fall of the government, tried to get into Europe via Bosnia. And for me, I covered the war in Bosnia, so it was incredibly painful to see many Afghans stalled at the border of Bosnia and Croatia in the Bihać region, which of course had been like a terrible battle back in 92 to 95. And of course, with Ukrainian refugees, it's been entirely different. The Afghans on the border trying to get into Europe are repelled, they're sent back, they keep trying. They're not welcomed, even, let's be honest, even when they get to Germany or Sweden, the attempts are not the same as it has been for Ukrainian refugees, where the doors have been opened. Basically, I know many families in Paris and London who are opening their homes. So I know this is a bit off topic, but could we compare? And one of the questions that actually from a reader that came in, I'm sorry, I'm cheating a bit, but it was such a good question. He said, could we compare the Afghan war to the Ukrainian war? It's from, I know I'm not supposed to do this yet, but it's from Joseph Lipinski. And I just think it's so great. It's, how does the war in Afghanistan and the war in Ukraine compare? Why did the Afghan army not fight? And why did the Ukraine army, why are they such extraordinary, the resistance? And I told you, Carter, earlier, I just came from the president's bunker where I was talking to his chief of staff, and never have I seen people more determined and sure that they are going to win, because as they put it, this isn't just a win for Ukraine, this is a win for democracy. So what conclusions can we reach for future involvements of America in foreign wars? So I'm cheating a bit, but sorry.
All right, so I'll let me. So the first thing I'd say in terms of why
the wars, yeah.
You asked why are the Ukrainians doing well, and the Afghans didn't do well. So, and there's many answers to that, and it certainly is a complex answer. But I'm going to take one that's probably overly simple. The Ukrainians are fighting to resist occupation. They're fighting to keep out an outsider. In Afghanistan, the Afghan army and police were fighting on the side of the occupier. And I don't think we were necessarily, I think we made a whole lot of mistakes and we did some bad things, but overall, I'm not trying to say that we were like the Russians or anything like that. But in terms of the ability to inspire and to get people to put their lives on the line and to go to the final mile, when an outsider is invading the country, especially a historic enemy, then that can be a much greater motivator than fighting on the side of an outsider who perhaps came in to do the right thing. We could discuss that and argue about that perhaps, but perhaps came in to try to do the right thing, but is an outsider, makes the government look like a puppet, inadvertently or overtly, and is of a different religion. It is going to be more difficult to inspire people to fight under those circumstances, or at least in Afghanistan, I would strongly argue it was more difficult. And whereas in Ukraine, I think we can see how the fact that they're standing up for their country is helping to motivate. Now, like I said, I'm simplifying a bit here. Well, I'm simplifying a lot here. So there's some other factors at play here. Right now, the Ukraine war is at the beginning of the war. It's not at the end of the war. And at the beginning of the 2001 conflict, we did point to other examples of Afghan heroism. You point to Karzai riding on a motorcycle, almost all alone into Uruzgan to try to rally people to fight the Taliban. You can point to people riding on horseback into Mazar-e Sharif. You can point to the fighters of Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ahmad Shah Massoud had just been killed by Al-Qaeda, yet they were ready to stand up against the Taliban. So at that early point, you could show more examples of heroism given how the time was at that point. But then over the course of the war, over 20 years of fighting, and the difficulties of fighting, but also the presence of us as occupiers, also corruption, this all whittled things down. So that kind of inspiration, if we can say it legitimately existed in 2001, wasn't there later on. So right now we're seeing a certain point with the Ukraine. We don't know how this is going to play out over time. And so would you like me to stop there or talk about lessons of intervention?
Yes, I think this is so interesting. And also I'd like you to talk about, I know it's hindsight, but what could we have done differently? Going all the way back to 9/11, like maybe there never should have been any kind of intervention. Could you, I know that's an enormous question, and this is basically why everyone must read your book. But could you simplify that in a sense for us, and just like what could we have done differently, and what lessons can we learn for future wars and future American involvement in these wars?
That sounds good, and I'll take it in the order that you just said. I'll mention a few of the mistakes, and then I'll mention what some lessons that we could take. So the first one she mentioned is, did we have to go in? I mean, I think from a very retrospective perspective and trying to take all the emotion out of it, one could say that, well, no, you didn't have to go in. We could have spent more time negotiating with Mullah Omar to get him to release release Osama bin Laden, and with the right kind of negotiations and patience on both sides, then something perhaps could have come. I'm not sure over that period that would have worked. I mean, for one thing, just how viscerally the United States felt the attacks on it. The high degree of polling that we know from the time demanding some kind of action and being willing to see intervention, the feeling on the part of the Bush administration that something had to be done, another attack was coming, and also the misinformation on both sides. The Bush administration, us, didn't have a good understanding of the Taliban and its relationship to Al-Qaeda. Mullah Omar didn't have a good understanding of us and how we were attacked and how we might react and what our military capabilities were at that time. Both Bush and Omar were very determined men. And so in this kind of circumstance, when there's a lot of domestic political pressure on both sides to not cooperate, it made it hard to be able to get out of the war. So that's like, I'd say that's one of the situations there. But if we take it a little bit further, we have to also ask, when the Taliban were toppled, why didn't we talk with them more? Why did we push them out of the government? And it's kind of well known that Rumsfeld, turned down in public any kind of negotiations with the Taliban. But after they fell, there's signs that they had certain interest in talking to us. So there's a big question of why didn't we do that? There's also a question of when the bond process was going and the conferences were being held and the Lloyd Georges were being held to establish what the new state was going to look like, why weren't the Taliban included in this? Now, largely it's because we thought they were defeated, but that's not really a good enough answer in terms of reaching out to the defeated enemy to bring the enemy into the negotiations. I mean, the Dayton Accords wouldn't have existed properly if there wasn't an ability to negotiate with the Bosnian Serbs in Serbia. And we don't like that, but to reach a political settlement, you have to do some things you don't like.
Although the Dayton Accords went very much in the Bosnian Serbs' favor. So in a sense, the perpetrators of that horrific war were rewarded rather than the Bosnian Muslims, who of course were the really suffered during that time. Sorry, I had to interrupt on that one.
And I don't mean to say that the Dayton Accords were done properly, merely that the diplomacy usually involves including all the various sides that are there. So another problem that if you take it a little bit further, one of the big questions is why, and this kind of gets to both US mistakes and United Nations mistakes. Why did we establish a government that was so centralized? Why did we establish a government where accountability was based on Kabul, Karzai, appointing leaders both in Kabul and in the provinces, so that those leaders cared about what Kabul was doing, what Karzai had to say, not what the people on the ground had to say? Why weren't we allowing a more federal structure or a more decentralized structure to exist that would allow the people to have more say in what was happening and make those leaders more accountable to the people? The argument there being, if that had been done, perhaps some of the grievances and the mistreatment that occurred at the hands of the government or warlords upon the people, perhaps that could have been averted. It's a little bit of a what if, but it is a pretty fundamental structural question about what happened. And people like Roger Myerson, Nobel laureate, and Thomas Barfield, famous anthropologists at Boston University, they've both argued that this would have been a better way to go. So let me jump forward a little bit. I'm skipping over a few other mistakes that we made. I want to go to the surge because what I just mentioned, there were three kind of large scale mistakes and three mistakes that if we had done something a little bit differently, may have changed the course of the war in a dramatic way. But after 2006, when the Taliban really start to attack, it's much harder to change the course of the war. Things have become set, things have become entrenched, resistance has become entrenched, we have more forces, we're fighting more, the more fighting we do, the more civilian casualties that occur, the more that turns various people against us. So it's harder later on to change the course of the war. So we get to the surge decision in 2009, which raises our numbers of troops in Afghanistan to 100,000. And President Obama is torn about what to do and how many troops should be sent. But in the end, it settles on, he increases basically, he increases 33,000 at that time, it raises to 100,000. The thought being that if we surge our forces, we'll be able to break the Taliban momentum, we'll be able to enable the Afghan government to stand on its own. Therefore, we'll be able to withdraw to a lower number and not have to fight the war so much. It'll be the problem, not the problem, it'll be the duty, the responsibility of the Afghan government to fight the war. So I think the problem here is we can really see in retrospect how the surge may have been tactically effective in various areas, but strategically it was not. It was too costly for us to continue. Afghan performance was not boosted sufficiently or could not be boosted sufficiently to make a big difference. And during the strategic discussions itself, it's clear that various options that might have been better weren't really even considered. Options like decreasing our forces, options like keeping the forces the same, options like keeping the forces the same yet deciding to stay for a long time and just manage the problem. Options like not increasing your forces until the Afghans have made some improvements in governance, or options like including negotiations as a part of any kind of surge strategy. So there's a variety of things that weren't fully considered and really should have been considered. And I'd state that as a large mistake. I wouldn't state that as a mistake in terms of, well, if we had done differently, we could have won the war. I'd state it as a mistake in terms of if we had done something different there, we could have saved lives, spent less money, and probably had the same result. And in the best of worlds, maybe we would have been willing to stay a bit longer and stick it out in Afghanistan, which, depending on what one's views are, maybe one thinks that would have been a better situation than what happened in August. I'm not sure that's actually the case, but my point there is to show that different action at that time could have led to something different now. Okay, so you ask what the lessons are for this. I mean, there's other mistakes, but I'm going to skip going into them. What are the lessons for now? So I think one of the big lessons out of Afghanistan is that if one wants to get involved in a civil war, in an intervention somewhere, and if that's before a country, it is risky, perhaps unwise, to think one can solve the problem there such that one can leave, such that one can have an exit strategy and stability lasts after you leave. I think Afghanistan shows how difficult that can be. I don't want to turn Afghanistan into a rule, because I think that that's not the right thing to do either, but it's cautionary. But this caution also fits with Iraq. I think you'd agree it fits with Bosnia as well. That we had to stay after that, and we stay still, and there are problems there. It hasn't gone the way we'd hoped it would have gone.
Big problems now because Putin's meddling again in yet another conflict.
Right.
Sorry, but yeah, continue with these. This is really interesting. And quite a few of the questions from the audience actually have to do with what you're talking about right now, the lessons learned.
So if you want to go in, one should expect that we'll have to stay for a long time. And if you expect you're going to have to stay for a long time, that's going to involve costs, which means you probably want to go in with as few forces as possible, as light as possible. and not go in thinking, well, we'll put in a lot of forces and then be able to change the situation such that we can leave later on. Because we've seen that doesn't work right. So better to be in for the longer haul, better to muddle through than to spend a lot of money expecting there's going to be a big difference. Now, if you have to stay a long time, that also involves costs, both political and economic. And if those costs don't sound right, the answer isn't to put in more forces. The answer is not to go in the first place. So if staying long should give one pause. It should give decision makers, make them question whether or not to go in, and make us less willing to get involved in these kind of conflicts. And that's not to say that we shouldn't get involved in them at all, and there aren't occasions when it's worthwhile, or even that there aren't occasions where the government just needs a little bit of help just to get back on top of things. I'm certain those kind of cases exist. But Afghanistan should make us all a bit more sober about it.
We have so many questions, but I just want to read two from former vets. One from Michael Cheney. It's just a comment where he says, the reason for the Vietnam remembrance is the easing of the American feelings of regret for the returning soldiers. Yes, I am a Vietnam vet. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you, Michael, for your service. The second is from another vet of Afghanistan, Daniel Avandolio. Having been someone who's been deployed to Afghanistan 6 times over the last 2 decades, most recently this past summer, I want to say thank you to Carter for such a phenomenally well-researched book. It's a great compliment. My question is, by and large, the average Afghan did not fight back, take up arms against the Taliban, as the Taliban closed in between 2020 until our eventual withdrawal in August 2022. However, the Ukrainian people have vehemently picked up arms to aggressively defend themselves and their nation from Russia. What do you think contributes to these differences? I think you answered that already earlier, didn't you? If there's not something else you want to ask, there's another question about Ghani. So I don't know if you want me to move on or you want to acknowledge that one.
Well, I want to acknowledge, Antonio, thank you for your service. I mean, 6 times, that's incredible. And thank you for being there last year at the time when everyone was so worried about what was happening. And I know that there was a lot of sacrifice on our side.
That's Daniel Avandolio.
Oh, Daniel, sorry, Daniel, I apologize, Daniel. Thank you for your service and what you did there. The only brief thing I would add in addition to what I said earlier is that, by 2020 and 2021, we were seeing the characteristics of a rout, where it's in the first place, the Afghans had trouble standing up and fighting, and often without our support, they wouldn't. And so that's the root cause of the collapse we see happening from 2020, 2021 onward. But the other thing that's happening by that time is the Afghans can now see what the future is going to look like. They can see that fighting may not get them anything, and they hear about other defeats. And it's like a stock market collapse. As they see that they're not going to be able to survive, they decide that they're not going to fight anymore. It just makes it worse. So it accelerated the situation to what we saw in July and August.
Carter, I'm going to give you 2 questions now because they're really coming in fast. This is amazing. One from Peter Pence, which says, on paper, Ashraf Ghani was the ideal president for Afghanistan. What role did he play in the development of the eventual disaster? And the second one comes from someone in Turkmenistan, Dovlet Gapov, who's the UN Office of Counterterrorism in Ashgabat. He writes, since the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan, the political path that neighboring countries have taken has not been to isolate Afghanistan, as had been done during the previous Taliban rule, but to involve it more in their current regional affairs. Some countries have gone even further by accepting newly appointed Taliban diplomats in their country's Afghan embassies. Question: what negative consequences and threats can bring such a dance with the Taliban to these countries? Want me to remind you again of them? One is about Ghani, his contribution to the disaster, and of course him fleeing in such an extraordinary way, leaving his people to their fate. And the other is about neighboring countries and the Taliban.
Thank you. So I've met Ashraf Ghani a few times. He was always very kind to me, and he always struck me as so incredibly committed to his country. So yeah, on paper, he was a good president, but I mean, in person, he cared about the country. He hated corruption. I don't believe in him personally corrupt, although definitely people under him were corrupt. And so, I mean, it makes you really feel for what he went through and what happened. And in a way, he was a leader cursed by history. He knew perhaps better than anyone else what had happened to all the Afghan rulers for the past 50 years. And in short, they were either killed in their beds or they were exiled to another country. Often their own forces and their own colleagues are the ones who killed them. So he knew that this was a distinct possibility, and I think it was on his mind and a concern for him. And he has stated this in various addresses since then. So when Kabul was in danger, and it seemed like the Taliban were into the city, I think that helped encourage him to leave earlier than he should have. On paper, yes, a very good president. Hard to be a person like me and because he's has a doctorate, et cetera, and he did great things with the Ministry of Finance, but often hard to be thrust in the middle of a war like he was. I guess I'll say a few things in his defense. One, and the most important, is that the reasons that we see Afghanistan failing during those years, it's largely for other reasons than President Ghani. It's largely that he's trying to grapple with these issues and just not being able to grapple with them highly effectively. I'm not sure if anyone else could have grappled with them highly effectively either, or maybe they would have done better, but I think the end result would have been the same. So that's a bit in defense. He gets a lot of criticism for being unwilling to talk to the Taliban and not giving concessions earlier on. There's probably something to that, but it should also be expected. Most partners who we work with like that, and take President Syngman Rhee in Korea during the Korean negotiations, and take General Thuy during the negotiations with the North Vietnamese. Those leaders who we were trying to force to give concessions, they don't want to give concessions. It's a very standard thing. So I don't see this as like particularly unique to Ashraf Ghani. Did it make it more difficult for us? Yes. Would it have made a difference in the end, given everything we saw in August? I don't think so. The region and how the region is dealing with the Taliban. Very good question.
The other stands, yeah.
So one thing that's different is during the later years of the war, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China became more concerned about Western presence in Afghanistan. And they were less tolerant of it because of the other geostrategic things that were happening. And so they became more willing to talk to the Taliban, especially when we were negotiating with the Taliban. And I think they partly did that to raise the Taliban's legitimacy and to make it a little bit more difficult for us. Now, so they allowed those connections to be made. Now, what they're also doing, besides that kind of malevolent intention, is they're trying to hedge. They too weren't sure if the Afghan forces could survive and succeed. And so they want to make sure that their interests in Afghanistan are upheld. And often for them, instability in Afghanistan is worse than dealing with the Taliban regime. So they're willing to have those kind of connections, even though they're not willing to officially recognize the Taliban, that's going too far. And I don't think from what they've said and what I've heard that Russia, Iran, or China feel a strong connection to the Taliban or believe that the Taliban are going to defend all of their interests. I think they're also wondering what the Taliban are going to do, and are worried about the future of what that country does. I think they prefer a government that was more inclusive. Each of them has different groups, well, China less, but Russia has longstanding connections with Uzbeks and Tajiks. Iran has longstanding connections with Hazaras and Tajiks. I think both Iran and Russia would prefer a government that was more inclusive in Afghanistan. But right now, the idea of fueling a civil war to overthrow the Taliban, I don't think is worth it from their perspective. I think the stability that the Taliban may provide is preferable for them.
Okay, we've got a request from the audience for you to speak Pashto, but I thought maybe you can sign off at the end with that. I want to give you a question from Ahmed Al Sayed, who's a former colleague of mine. We worked on human rights in the Middle East. He asks you, my question as a student of international legitimacy of armed groups, how does the author assess the international standing of the Taliban at the moment? The fact that it falls short of formal international recognition aside. Also, how did or does the Taliban attain international recognition?
So I'd actually say that the Taliban had more international legitimacy probably when they were negotiating, because there was more interest in having contact with them. There was more at stake at that time for us to have the connections with them. And many Western powers were talking to them regularly, as were a variety of other countries. So there was at least that doesn't mean that they're in a more official position, they have more power right now. But in terms of their legitimacy, I think their legitimacy is actually a little bit better then. Since that, their legitimacy has been marred by, well, the announcement last week regarding women, the government that's not inclusive, some of the treatment of people who want to become refugees or people who are their opponents. This has all caused more problems for the Taliban, and in fact, the way they took Kabul has meant a lot of countries very, very leery to deal with them and not want to engage them. I'm not sure how long that we should be not engaging the Taliban. That's not. I don't expect the Taliban to concede to many of the things that we want, and I don't think that there's much hope in putting conditionality on our discussions with them or our diplomatic recognition of them or on any kind of humanitarian assistance. I think the reasons that we want to deal with the Taliban at some point are probably twofold. One is the humanitarian concern of what's happening in Afghanistan, and I don't have a good reason not to give humanitarian aid. I only have good reasons not to expect the Taliban to do things that help us a lot. But humanitarian aid is different. So that's one compelling factor. The other compelling factor for us is that not having an embassy places is generally not terribly helpful. Usually not having that kind of contact, especially by several nations, prevents us a degree of understanding with that people and with that people's government. And if you don't have that degree of understanding, then when a crisis occurs or you need something to happen, it's going to be more difficult to make those things happen. We're better off being able to discuss the next terrorist thing that happens out of Afghanistan, which is a reasonable likelihood that it'll happen if we have an embassy there than if we don't have an embassy there. That's not trying to say that the Taliban are a good government or anything like that. But we have an embassy in Russia, and we have an embassy in a variety of countries, and places where we don't, it's just tended to be very problematic. What can the Taliban do to get recognition? So the number one thing is I think for the United States, the number one thing would be meet the commitments they have made toward not supporting terrorist groups, not allowing terrorist groups to operate out of Afghanistan. I think that's the thing that's going to, if anything that goes wrong there is going to make it very difficult for people to have any kind of recognition. The other thing is a more inclusive government. I think that would help tremendously. And then education, women's rights was 3, 4, which is probably the least important, but still matters a decent amount, is if aid that's given to help the people of Afghanistan, basically humanitarian aid, the Taliban can't filter that, can't be taking it, putting it in their own pockets. It has to be able to go to the people. Any kind of filtering or putting it in their own pockets is only going to make it more difficult for them to get recognition. Now, having said those things that will help with recognition, again, I don't have hope that many of those are going to happen. My exposure to the Taliban is that they are very committed in what they believe, and they believe they are doing it to provide stability and security for the Afghan people. They believe their country has gone through 4 years of civil war because they weren't following the precepts of Islamic law and weren't trying to have the kind of hierarchy and unity that the Taliban can provide. They've won the war, and so they're not impressed with other threats that we have to offer.
We don't have much time left, but there's 2 short, if you can answer them in a short way, because I think they're both really interesting. One is from your old friend who was General Carter's press secretary of ISAF in 2013, Patty Jackson, who said, do you agree that one of the main mistakes we ISAF made was to train the ANSF to fight in the wrong way, too reliant on NATO, US assets, logistics, etc. The other question is a really good one as well. And so I'm going to hope you can answer them both. It's about education. And it said, it's from David Edwards. It said, of all the various areas in which Western allies tried to improve the quality of life in Afghanistan, it is arguable that education was the domain that was most successful, expanded, and improved. Does this argument hold up? What were the strengths and weaknesses of the educational system introduced after 2001? So if you have time for that, and then I'll sign off, and then you need to say goodbye in Pashto.
So Patty, thank you for the note. Good to hear from you. And so did we train them, did we not train them the right way we made them too much in our mode, the mode of us, and didn't make them sufficiently unconventional? I mean, so I think there's an argument there that there was an extent to which we made them too conventional and too dependent on our support. However, I don't think that if we had trained them differently, that we would have necessarily gotten a hugely different result. I think we have a tendency to look at, if we had just done something a little bit different, if we had just changed our training or changed our tactics, that could have had a different result. And my tendency is to think that, no, there's some deeper reasons here as to why failure occurred. The structure of the government, the corruption in the government, the ideal of resisting occupation, on the fractures within the government versus the somewhat better cohesion the Taliban had, Pakistan. These are big structural factors. And so I'm not sure that there was something that someone on the ground could have done or our soldiers could have done from any of our countries to create success through their tactical actions. David, thank you for the question on education. So education, I think, is something where we did do better, not perfect. There's plenty of SIGAR reports that show all the mistakes that were made there. I know there are plenty of schools without teachers. There's plenty of corruption that happened on the education front. But my experience in Helmand and other places was that, well, we did not just build a lot of schools, do enough organization and discussion and coordination to ensure that those schools had students, they had teachers, they had materials for the students to work with. Sometimes the schools weren't nice looking. Sometimes they were under a tent. Sometimes they were in a small mud building. But that's better than nothing. And in a large number, they were in buildings. And perhaps the greatest testimony to the success of the education effort was when the Taliban were controlling areas of Afghanistan, up until 2021. In many of them, the schools were still running. They let the schools still run. Now, that was funded by Western money, but it was good enough to be able to operate under the control of the Taliban as well as places under the control of the government. Today, some of those same schools are running as well, although I don't have as good of information as to what extent they are. And for those schools, that gave those Afghans who grew up there in the past 20 years, those schools gave some of them an education. It doesn't justify our intervention. It doesn't mean it was right. It doesn't mean it was worthwhile. But it is a small silver lining on an otherwise very difficult and painful experience.
Thank you, Carter. That was great. So everyone, we've got so many more questions, but I'm afraid we have to wrap up. But Carter, this has been so fascinating. And for me, I learned so much from you. And I'm actually going to go back and read your book a second time. And I urge everyone who hasn't read it to do so. Carter, congratulations again. You really wrote an extraordinary book and you worked so hard, and it really is a force. It's really been my pleasure, Janice, I know you're still there, to serve on the jury and have this opportunity to have you both here tonight. The Lionel Gelber Prize has such a revered history, and it's been great for me to bring it to light. So for me in Kyiv, in Ukraine, good night, everyone. Good morning to you. And I'll hand it to you, Carter, to say goodbye in Pashto.
Thank you, Janine. Janine, sos mamastis ukadir manana. Sma and the Walano Chol Hogo Che, da Haberete, Alredo Dirman, Staso Wax Dirman, Tasso Tawajos Dirman. Sma American, the American Gawande, the American and the Walano. Staso Askaro the Korbanizaka, Diramanano, Hasmatzaka Diramanana, Sma Afghanan and Ivalano. Eid Mubarak, Staso Korbanizaka Diramanana. So Pohejim Che Owus Halat Dir Sakhdi, a son Nadi, Tashwish Makawe, Purat Lunke Halat Basamiji, America Lahum Staso Andevaldi, Canada Staso Andevaldi, Britain Staso Andevaldi, Mushila Kuche Staso Bashejuan Willery, Zufikr Pumpra Lunke America, Nirawal Tone Ba Afghanistan Marasta Kawe, Wakche Usakti Ba Purat Lunke Samiji, Beherakat Ke Barakade, Dirmanan Salam Alaikum.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you for your participation. Thank you, Carter, again. Deepest congratulations for a wonderful book.
Thank you very much.